There is a moment in every martial arts confrontation when confidence crosses over into something more dangerous. It is not the moment when two people step onto a mat. It is not even the moment when the first technique is thrown. It is the moment when one person decides, before anything has happened at all, that they already know how the story ends. That is what happened when a Krav Maga instructor, well decorated in the Israeli system and convinced of its supremacy, stepped into a room where a Filipino Arnis master was teaching his students. The instructor looked at the rattan sticks, the flowing circular motions, the seemingly casual way the Filipinos moved between angles, and he laughed. He said it out loud, with the confidence of someone who had never lost a fight. That laughter did not last long. To understand why what happened next stunned everyone in that room, you have to go back long before either man was born. You have to go back to the islands, to the centuries before any Spanish ship ever broke the horizon of the Philippine Sea. Long before the colonial powers arrived, before the archipelago even had the name the world knows it by today, the people of those islands were already developing one of the most sophisticated systems of close-range combat ever conceived by human beings. The warrior class known as the Mandirigma was not a ceremonial institution. These were fighters trained from childhood in the fluid, weapon-integrated art that would eventually be known to the world as Arnis, Eskrima, and Kali. They did not separate the weapon from the body. In their philosophy, the blade and the hand were the same instrument, and that idea changed everything about how they trained. The art they developed operated on principles that most combat systems only discovered much later. Where other martial traditions taught unarmed combat first and then introduced weapons as an advanced module, the Filipino system reversed that logic entirely. Students began with weapons, learning to move their bodies in service of the blade before they ever learned to strike with an open hand. The reasoning was elegant and ruthless at the same time. If you trained the body to flow around a weapon, the empty hand would inherit all of that fluency naturally. The result was a practitioner who did not think about whether they were armed or unarmed because the distinction had been erased from their muscle memory. That is not a philosophical stance. It is a tactical one, and it was forged in real conflict across centuries of island warfare, raider attacks, and colonial resistance. The Spaniards who arrived in the 16th century learned this the hard way. In 1521, when Ferdinand Magellan led his armored, musket-bearing forces onto the shores of Mactan Island, he was met not by a people who surrendered to superior firepower but by warriors under the command of Lapulapu, a chieftain who had spent his life training in the indigenous fighting systems of his people. Magellan did not survive the encounter. The Spanish chronicles of that era recorded with barely concealed astonishment that the native fighters moved with a precision and speed around bladed weapons that their own trained soldiers could not match in close quarters. When the Spanish eventually returned in sufficient numbers to colonize the archipelago, they were so threatened by the fighting abilities of the Filipino people that they banned the practice of the art entirely. That ban did not extinguish anything. It only pushed the art underground, where it was preserved in ritual dances, festival performances, and the private instruction passed between master and student in the shadows of colonial rule. By the time the 20th century arrived, the art had not only survived, it had deepened. The underground tradition known as Juego Todo, which translates roughly as all-around play, kept the competitive edge of the art razor sharp through real matches held during town fiestas across the islands. These were not exhibition bouts. Fighters signed up knowing they could be seriously hurt, that the match ended only when someone could no longer continue. Champions emerged from those festivals carrying not trophies but reputations so fearsome that other fighters withdrew from competitions the moment a known master entered his name on the list. One such legend was José Caballero, the founder of the de campo style, whose precision and economic efficiency in close-range weapon combat became the standard by which other practitioners measured themselves. These were not myths. These were documented, witnessed, and remembered by communities who understood exactly what they were watching. What most people outside the Philippines do not realize, even today, is that Arnis and its sister systems never remained a regional secret. They traveled with the Filipino diaspora and found new homes in military and law enforcement academies far from the islands where they were born. The United States Army did not adopt Kali into its modern Army combatives program as a gesture of cultural goodwill. Army Ranger Matt Larson, the man credited as the architect of the modern combative system, studied fighting arts from around the world before building his curriculum, and Filipino Kali earned its place not through politics but through results. The techniques for transitioning between weapons and empty hands, for controlling distance at close range, and for neutralizing an armed threat with minimal wasted motion were not replicated anywhere else at the level Filipino masters had developed them. The Russian Spetsnaz reached the same conclusion independently. So did Indian Special Forces. The art had, quietly and without fanfare, become foundational to some of the most elite combat training programs on the planet. Krav Maga, the system the Israeli instructor in that room represented, also has an extraordinary history of its own. It was developed in the 1930s and 1940s by Imi Lichtenfeld, a boxer and wrestler who needed a system that could be learned quickly and applied under extreme stress. The Israeli Defense Forces adopted it as the backbone of their hand-to-hand training because it worked. It was direct, aggressive, and designed to end encounters in seconds by targeting the body's most vulnerable points without ceremony. There was nothing decorative about Krav Maga. It did not ask its practitioners to be graceful. It asked them to survive. That philosophy produced some of the toughest, most combat-ready soldiers in the world, and the men and women who carried those credentials had earned the right to take their training seriously. The problem was never the system. The problem was the assumption that one system's effectiveness meant another system's irrelevance. The instructor who walked into that Filipino training hall that afternoon had spent years building his expertise in an environment where Krav Maga's dominance was rarely questioned. His certifications were real, his experience was genuine, and his confidence was the natural product of a training culture that valued aggression and decisiveness above all else. When he looked at the Arnis students moving through their drills with rattan sticks and training blades, he saw what an uninformed eye often sees in Filipino martial arts. He saw something that looked loose, almost playful, full of flowing circular movements that did not resemble the sharp linear aggression he had spent years perfecting. He did not see what was actually happening. He did not see the angles being calibrated with every step, the distance management being practiced in patterns that had been refined across 500 years of real combat. He saw what he wanted to see, and he said so. The Filipino master who was teaching that class had heard dismissals before. It was not the first time someone with credentials from another system had walked into an Arnis school and struggled to take what they were witnessing seriously. The art had always attracted that reaction from outsiders because it did not look the way people expected deadly combat to look. It was not theatrical. It did not announce itself with the sharp key eyes and rigid stances of East Asian martial traditions. Filipino fighting moved like water around a stone, always finding the line of least resistance, always arriving at the target from an angle the opponent had not accounted for. The master did not respond to the instructor's dismissal with anger. He responded with an invitation. He asked the Krav Maga instructor to put on protective gear and hold a training knife, and then he told him to try to use it. What happened in the next few minutes became the subject of conversation that spread far beyond that training hall. The Krav Maga instructor was not slow. He was not inexperienced. He knew how to move with aggression and commitment, how to close distance and establish control. But from the moment the drill began, he found that every angle he thought he owned had already been anticipated. The Filipino master did not block him. He redirected, peeled away from the line of attack at fractions of a second that felt to the instructor like being in a room where the walls kept shifting. Disarms came not from strength but from leverage applied at the precise joint angle where resistance was impossible. When the instructor tried to counter, he found that the master had already transitioned to a completely different position. The instructor tried again, and each time the result was the same. By the time the drill ended, the instructor was not laughing anymore.